Hello there. In this video, I'm going to show how to display dynamic data to users. What is dynamic data? Dynamic data is data that is user generated, and therefore you cannot know upfront how many of certain elements are going to have to display, and you don't know what exactly those elements are going to contain. As an example, I will show the preview here. If I had a movie project app where a user can create new movie projects by clicking this little plus button, and then in those movie projects, they might be able to select a thumbnail, and they might be able to change the title of that movie project, and then they can create another one and do the same thing. They can change the thumbnail and the title, and then they can even delete one of them again. This is all dynamic data. This means that I don't know if I have to display 2 movies or 20 movies. I just need to display a bunch of them. This is quite common in more advanced web apps, and I found that Framer didn't have very intuitive basic tools to do this. So, of course, a lot of developers will then switch to code components where you can create whatever you want, including, of course, a tool like this. But then the downside of code components is that it becomes very engineering heavy, and it loses some of the visual advantages that you have when you're working with the visual interface of Framer. So what we have over here is a grid component, a regular Framer grid component, with inside of that a project card. Now the project card is also a component, and it shows over here that it's not a code component, but just a regular visual components, allowing for also a designer or someone non-technical to go in here at a later time and start tweaking because they might not really like the way something looks or the way something feels or the way something animates. This to me is a huge, huge advantage in terms of pipeline, that we can empower the designers, we can empower the artist to modify parts of our application without the support of an engineer afterwards. So I really prefer to work in projects where, as an engineer, I can create the tools, but I am not the barrier for the designer to make the application feel better and work better. So that's kind of the idea behind all this. Part of that is because I come from a games background. I'm not actually a web developer, and in video games, this is how we do things. So I just like to see how well we can do this in the web as well. So I've shown the application, what we're going to create. I'm going to recreate it from scratch. But before we do that, I would like to also quickly show the code that I wrote for this. So I'm selecting my grid. The grid is the only part of my application that has code. And again, it's not a code component, it is a code override. By the way, if you're not familiar with these terms, I recommend reading up on that first or watching some other videos on that first, even playing around with it, because this video is not going to be super, super basic. So we're going to probably skip over a few concepts that might be a little unfamiliar to you. So again, if you don't know code overrides from code components or even the visual components as I showed them, I recommend starting with some more beginner-friendly tutorials. But for those who are ready, I'm going to jump into edit code here just to show you the code that the final application has. So it's quite a bit of code. This is all in that same code override, which is called with project card list, which has a few different pieces to handle the adding and removing of cards and the editing of cards, and a bunch of helper functions. Now, don't get too intimidated by all this. We're going to rebuild it from scratch, so we're going to go over what all these things do and hopefully step by step kind of display how an app like this is built. So let's get started in a new project. In this project, I have done absolutely nothing except create a little title header, which is called My Movie Project. And now, of course, I want to show a grid that is going to display my different movie projects. Now, again, I'm using the Framer grid here, which gives me this great advantage that without even having to write any code or do anything, I have a grid with a bunch of frames and I can already see, oh, that's what that would look like. It looks great. I have some gap. I have some padding if I wanted. Anyway, very visual, very designer friendly, even developer friendly, honestly. I really do think that developers also shouldn't always want to write code for everything. It's great to use visual tools when they're saving you time and helping you create a better product. So this frame is going to be your project card. So I'm going to go here to create components and I'm going to write project card. And again, if this concept is entirely new to you, then I recommend watching some videos on how to create visual components in Framer. This project card is going to have an image fill, so I'm going to create a variable and I will call this, you know what, I'll call it image. What a great name for my variable. So there's my image. There's no value by default, that's okay. Then I'll create a little text over here, which is going to be the project title, and that looks pretty good like that. Maybe do some padding here, 1515, love it. And let's create a little variable for that too. I'll create a plain text and I'll call that project title as well. That's also the default name, hopefully not confusing, but this is just the variable name project title. And there we have it. Maybe I'll create a little background here in case someone has a very white image. That would make it difficult to read the project title, so I'm just going to create this bottom part here. Well, that looks good enough for a demo, I'd say. And there we have it. I have my grid, and I can duplicate my project cards, and look at that. I can just see them right away, how they would look. And in fact, I can change the title. So if I said, okay, this is the Joker movie, which has the Joker image in it, then it's already working. Now, of course, this isn't what I'm trying to show you, because this is just how you can do that with static content. But for us, the whole point is to do this with dynamic content. And for that, we're gonna have to write some code. And the code that I'm gonna have to write is going to go on my grid component. So this parent grid component is going to contain all the code for this project. Now that's not going to be a code component, but it's going to be a code override. And the advantage of that is that I can keep this entire interface that Framer has already provided for me and use that to manage the layout and style of my grid, and use a code override purely for the technical complicated things. So let's go and create a new file, and I'll call that dynamic grid, and it's create. And I can see there is a whole lot of code in here that I don't want, and I'm gonna delete all of that. And we're gonna start off with an empty function, which is a basic component returning itself. So I can see I just have two imports over here, and then the function with project cards list. And this is the components, or sorry, the function that I'm going to have to set in the inspector. So I'm going to go into the layers again, go select my grid and select your dynamic grid and an override with project cards list. I'm going to go back to edit the code. Now, what does this code actually do? It returns a forward ref function which receives props and refs and really just creates a new component in that, which doesn't do anything. So it really returns the same component with the same props. So if I press preview right now, I see nothing has changed, and that is what I expected. And hopefully what you expected as well, because this again does nothing. Now, what do I want it to do? I want this to start to display a dynamic amount of project cards, Right now, it shows based on how many project cards I placed in Framer. But in the future, I want to be able to dynamically populate this. So in order to do that, this part of my code needs to understand what a project card is. So to create that reference, I can go into Assets and scroll down here into Project Card and select these 3 dots and copy import. And let me go back to my dynamic grid and hit paste. Actually, I'm going to put it on the first line. And now I have a new import statement, which says import project card from blah, 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 blah. This is generated by Framer once I create a component. And by using this import statement, I now have the type project card accessible in my code. I'm still not using it anywhere, and that will come in, but it will come in handy in a little bit. Now, before I can display multiple project cards, I'm going to create a variable that stores the data that's going to be in the project card. So that will be things like the title of the project, the image in the project, and maybe whatever other information in the future I might want to add. So I just need a little data array. And I'm going to do that right over here. Keep in mind, don't do it before the return statement. Do it after the return forward ref statement. And then we're going to create a little instances object that can be modified by set instances. This, if you're familiar with React, is the useState function, which allows us to easily listen to updates whenever the instances array is modified. If you're not familiar with React, this might be a little complicated to understand, but hopefully through the continuation of the implementing this code, it will become more and more obvious. So right now, all you need to know is that this creates an instances variable, can be modified by calling set instances, and has a default value of currently an array with 2 empty objects. In fact, I can just make this an empty array. And so now my instances variable is by default an empty array, nothing inside of it. Great. Now, it doesn't even matter what's inside of it because we're still not doing anything with it. And that's what we're going to change now though. So I'm going to go into this return statement where I'm returning the component, and I'm going to add this piece here, which maps my instances array to project cards. So for each data object I have in my instances array, I will generate 1 project card. So a little question for you is, how many project cards do you think will be displayed? If you're thinking 0, then you are correct. Because my instances array is currently empty, this is the default value, it's an empty array. So really what I'm saying here is map my empty array to project cards, meaning that's not going to show anything. So let's take a look and see if that is correct. Go into home and I press play, and there we have it. I see 0 project cards. And again, that was expected. This is, even though there is a single project card in the grid, if I have 2 project cards here, again, it will show 0, because when this component gets rendered, it will immediately map that instances array to display the project cards, and it displays 0. So in fact, if I did want to display more, I can start populating this array with some objects. Again, this is just a default value. Later, we're going to be changing this on runtime, but for now, it's just a default value. So set it to 3 and save. Now, these are 3 empty JavaScript objects. There's no data in there. There's nothing in there. So let's just go back and press play. And look at that. Now I have 3 elements in my grid. And in fact, I can delete it altogether from this and then press play. And again, it shows 3 in preview. I usually leave 1 in, otherwise it just becomes such an empty shell, but that's really just for visual advantages, and it doesn't really matter if you have 1 or 2 in here because it gets replaced on runtime. So now let's get to the part where we can change the properties on these cards, because currently they're all just showing project title, project title, project title. Of course, I want them to have unique data. And to change the properties on my cards, I need to remember that there is in my components this section with the variables, and one of them was, for example, project title. And if I set this to the Joker, then this changes to the Joker. So what I need to do is change this variable, but through code, because that way I can actually have it contain dynamic data. So let's go back to my dynamic grid code. Sometimes, by the way, I go over here by selecting the grid and then go edit code. Sometimes I select assets and just click here. Just both lead you to the same destination. The data that I need to provide here, ideally, you might think, oh, what was it called again? Project title. Maybe that was the Joker. And in the next object, project title, Titanic. This would be great. I'm just going to delete this one. And then when we hit play, we see that didn't work at all. So even though I put the data in here, which again is just an array of objects, instances that get passed on to the project card, you might think like, great, I'm passing project title, just matching the name that Framer had created, so therefore it could work. But unfortunately it doesn't, because what Framer does with these variables that we create when you select a project card, all these variables under the hood, they're called something else. So they're not called project title, they're not called image, but they get a generated name from Framer. Now, luckily, I have some helper functions that can get you that generated name based on the name that we set in the Framer interface. So let me copy paste those helper functions in here, and I'll briefly explain the helper functions. This one is get Framer property key, so I would give a component type. So for example, project card is the type, and property name would be project title or image. Those are the two property names I currently have. Then it will look into this. This is a property type from Framer. It's called property controls, and it will search through them and it will check, is the title of that property the property name that I'm giving it here? So if the title is, for example, image, then it will return the actual key. And the key is usually something like GBH87T, something not human friendly. So we just need to have the code to get that back, and then we're not going to worry about what exactly that key is. So I'm going to use these functions to get those properties. And then, so this is a function to get the Framer property key. And here I can even get an entire object that essentially maps the visual names to the keys that Framer has created under the hood. And I'm going to use that to actually create these first objects. So instead of setting that object directly, I'm going to replace this with create Framer component props project card. So I'm saying the type is project card, and the property names are, and this is the same as what I said before, project title would be the Joker. Now, what does this do? It takes this object and it loops through everything I'm providing in this object, and again, maps it to a new object which uses the underlying key. In other words, it just makes it work. So I'm going to do that here again, and this is Titanic. And then we should, oh, I'm missing a little bracket here. Here we go. And then we should hopefully see that this data, so project title The Joker, project title Titanic, display in my dynamic data. And what do you know? It's showing.